I watched The Substance recently and found it to be a rather shallow statement on the entertainment industry, although that statement in itself is still quite reductive. While the film covered more than this alone, I couldn't help but be bothered by the increasing popularity of empty media that is continually hyped to no end. The internet today is flooded with people trying to make singular, all-encompassing statements in regard to things that are inherently much more complex. I don't want to focus as much on the way this occurs rather than the specific danger of consuming such content on a regular basis. The phrase, "you are what you eat," details exactly what it states. The same rules apply to the consumption of media and content online. By extension, if you often engage with content that is much less than the sum of its parts, your tastes may change with that increased engagement. This is a scary thought when considered on a broader level. Everything you may see, read, or hear becomes a potential catalyst or threat for rewiring our minds on a basic level, but a level all the same that commits such information regardless of whether we've consented for that choice to be made. When I recently sat down and completed Super Castlevania IV for the first time on my Super Nintendo, I couldn't help but notice how complete and direct it is as one singular experience. 11 stages of tight and sometimes brutally unforgiving level design, yet a game you can pick up and complete within a couple of hours if you have some basic experience with platforming. I recently played a newer indie title by the name of Blasphemous, one which I did not have high expectations for as a singular experience. It was quite disappointing to play a game so thoroughly inspired by the idea of a game rather than playing a holistically considered piece. What I mean by this is that games such as Blasphemous, Hollow Knight, or Animal Well may suffer in similar patterns as other forms of modern entertainment. There's a trend of stretching a game or piece of media to its furthest corner of thinkable comprehension rather than finishing a game at a moment of well-met satisfaction. The idea of more is more seems to drag everything continuously into a melting pot of things that many people come to enjoy, but fewer people can ever truly love. Putting games aside, this issue has its place in the modern setting of an artist such as King Gizzard, a band I have thoroughly discussed in the past by way of songwriting and structure. With the modern appeal of their live concerts, especially in the United States, there's a level of growth that has occurred to where loving the band is beyond the previously set notion of observing their growth as musicians. The unfortunate truth of this is that King Gizzard have realized this idea with the well-intentioned bootlegger system. This is an open agreement to fans who want to release their own forms of the band's free use catalog to create releases and compilations of their own. While I like the nature of this idea, I'm not surprised that much of the resulting content feels as shallow as playing any modern Souls-like or watching films that all want their piece of the pie without putting in any semblance of true soul into a project. Everything is likable enough, highly marketable, but loved by no one. Some may consider this an overly cynical viewpoint on what is really just inspired art, but I would argue that works that are successful in defining themselves without giving into the idea of general trends are often more valuable as an experience that warrants meaningful discussion and grants further insight upon successive runs. Runs in this case just refers to experiencing something again after an initial watch, play, or listen. To make this point clearer, I'd like to showcase some relatively newer releases that are well-balanced pieces, at least that I believe to be. They're by no means perfect, but their works I feel showcase a unique addition to the conversation of their respective fields or genres. First up is an offbeat experimental horror film titled Skinamarink. I think that this is a good example of someone trying something new not just for the sake of riding a wave of hype and getting everyone's money. The cinematography is extremely static and intensely bleak, which at least had me wondering exactly what the point was at times. But as I watched more, I began to really appreciate the uniqueness of the experience as a whole. There's a nicely visceral motivation of exploring an aspect of creativity that could be deemed as meaningless to many. This circles back to my previous point, how you are what you consume. There are clear patterns and trends to what the general public is going to enjoy or not enjoy, and I think that Skinamarink is quite a brave directorial debut given the modern expectations of art and how it typically molds to the consumer. Another good example is Hyperdemon, a game which requires a similar fundamental rewiring of what you may know as a consumer. This kind of thing is more common in games, but what's most interesting about Hyperdemon is how quickly you're thrown into the chaos and that your enjoyment of the game is truly dependent on whether you can innovate and determine options to improve your playstyle. Typically, games will include tutorials for familiarizing the player with the general control system, but Hyperdemon forgoes this altogether to create an experience that feels more primal and experience-based. You get the sense that projects like these could be initially thought of by someone who really was inspired by one deliberate idea and wanted to craft a unique experience, rather than someone sitting down wondering, what kind of game do I make? This returns me to my point of discussing trending media in the context of creativity. If we are what we consume, and the internet wants to shove bite-sized opinions, advice, and lists of everything you should or should not do, then we slowly become beings that can only depend on the influx of engagement rather than having any of our own instincts to trust. This is by no means a new argument against social media, but the more it becomes a thing of the past, the less I notice it being discussed by anyone at all. I figure many are aware that this thing is slowly eating away at all of us, and most of us are too tired, or better yet, run down by the excessive stream of noise that we become complacent with the end result. I can't seem to find a decent way to turn this into a positive ending, but I think that's actually beneficial to my point. There's not necessarily any lesson to be learned here. This is rather a criticism on what we should have learned in the earlier stages of the internet, or even before then. I think the more important thing to remember here is you have some control over who and what influences you, as well as drawing that distinction and in turn making an active choice. That's all I have for this, so if you stuck around for all that, thanks for watching.